Everybody, and welcome to the dinner portion of our Stars and Stripes Forever, a World War II concert event. My name is Mr. Brad Hart. I am the band director here at Johansson in my third wonderful year. My cohort in crime for this event and kind of the other brainchild for this is Miss Ann Amador, who's helping us with students gathering. One of our main goals for this evening for the dinner party is to allow students to show some of the stuff they've been working on. As you can see around the room, there are lots of projects here. There are also some projects in the theater lobby when you go over for the concert a little bit after 7. There is also some wonderful memorabilia stuff up here as well. So some very interesting things. We have a couple of guest speakers here with us tonight, and we'll introduce them here in a little bit. But before we do that, we're going to have some students do some readings, and hopefully we'll allow you to continue to have nice conversations about everything and kind of get in the spirit of thinking and talking about World War II. So to introduce the student speakers and what they're going to be doing, this is Miss Ann Amador.
Are very important in history. And these primary sources are letters that were written either by soldiers during World War II or their loved ones. So you'll get a variety of different letters. And the soldiers that served during World War II, like soldiers today, we have information that they said these letters were so valuable to their mindset during the war. So each of the students is going to share a little bit different experience of the war, starting in 1941.
This is Lieutenant Paul E. Spangler writing to his friends in Portland, Oregon. It's dated December 17th, 1941. We had a little disturbance out here a week ago Sunday, and it was something. I was not certain what was going on until I came off the hill on my way to the hospital. Then I saw the smoke from the fires. I expected to see my maker most any moment that morning. I hurried up to the surgery, and already the casualties were pouring in. It was hell for a while. These poor devils were brought in all shot up, burned. We gave them plenty of morphine and set them out on the boards to die. Don't quote me, but this is the real dope. We have just 3 battleships that can fight now. Aircraft lost are certainly over 200. If you think Japan didn't do a thorough job, guess again. We wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and remember Pearl Harbor.
This is Private Paul Curtis, writes writing to his brother Mitchell. Dear Mitchell, I don't think any man can exactly explain combat. Take a combination of fear, anger, hunger, thirst, exhaustion, disgust, loneliness, homesickness, and wrap that all up in one reaction, and you might approach the feelings a fellow has. It makes you feel mighty small, helpless, and alone. The battle seems like something in a faraway land. The war is even as bad as the movies have it. The cries of the wounded are pitiful. The dead seem forsaken, things rage on all around them, but they are still and quiet. Love, Paul. This was the last letter that Paul Curtis ever wrote. He was killed the very next day.
This letter is from the First Lieutenant Sidney Diamond, and he writes it to his fiancée, Estelle. January 19th, 1945. Darling, somewhere in the Philippines, in combat again. A lot to say, but A, very tired, B, very dirty, C, busy as hell. Been moving constantly. Excuse brevity. I love you. You make my foxhole warm and soft. Sweetheart, yours, Sid. Sidney Diamond was killed in the Philippines. He was 22.
This is from a woman named Marjorie to her husband, Roland. No letter again today. I hope I get one this He hates to come without a letter. He never looks my way when he hasn't got one. When I go to church these few times, I kneel and I start to pray, and I can't describe the feeling that comes over me. You and God and love are all mixed up. It's just a strong feeling. It just surges out of me and wraps itself around you wherever you are, whatever you are doing. My mind usually sees you in a plane, and I can feel myself putting my arms around you and cradling your head against my breast and protecting your body with my spirit, really, I guess. I love you so and miss you so. Be strong and have faith. Your Marjorie.
This letter was from Combat Nurse June Gordon. Dearest family, we now have a mix of wounded and battle-fatigued soldiers. Each category has their arm. The wounded were happy to be missing only one arm or leg. I have a terrible heartache, but as usual, I have to work. The patients need me. A few days ago, I was giving medications before whiteout. As I finished, this one very young soldier, I was shoving his blankets around him. He said, my mother always kissed me goodnight when she tucked me in my bed. So I kissed him on the forehead. He blushed, covered his head with the blanket, and everyone else called, Mommy, Mommy, loved you.
This letter is from Warrant Officer Frank J. Conwell, and he writes to his aunt and uncle, February 6, 1945. Hello, John, Anne, and all the little ones. The weather has been very cold over here with plenty of snow, and more snow. As I look at the kids sledding, throwing snowballs, it brings back many memories of the good times I had when I was a kid. All of us lads took out our flexible flyers and went belly walking down the hills. We made snowmen with it and packed it to hard round balls that caught other kids in the head and then melted down the backs of their necks. When our feet got cold, we would call it a day. When we were kids, the snow sure was fun. There's a lot of snow on the western front these days, and the country looks like a Christmas card. It's beautiful, but the flexible flyers have turned into tanks. The snowballs are grenades. The wet stuff trickling down the back of our necks is often blood. And when you're numb with the cold, there's no place to go. Nothing to look forward to, nothing but snow. Cold, wet, beautiful snow. Hoping this letter finds you all in the best of health. Sincerely, Frank.
This is an African-American soldier letter to Army Weekly Nightly, April 1944. Myself and 8 other Negro soldiers were on our way from Camp Clarabelle, Louisiana to Arizona. We had a layover until the next day for our train. We could not purchase a cup of coffee at any of the lunchrooms around there. The only place where we could be served was at a railroad station, but of course we had to go into the kitchen. As you know, old man Jim Crow rules. But that's not all. 11:30 a.m., about 24 German prisoners of war, 2 American guards, came to the station. They were at the tables. They had their meals served, talked, smoked, and in fact had a swell time. I stood on the outside looking on, and I could not help but ask myself these questions. Are we not American soldiers, sworn to fight for and die, if need be, for this, our country? Then why are they treated better than we are? Why does the government allow such things to go on? Some of the boys are saying that you will not print this letter, but I am saying that you will. Corporate Hubert Trinningham.
This is a letter from Private First Class Ernest Uno to his sister May. He was stationed in Livorno, Italy, and was part of the Japanese-American 442nd Regiment. Dearest May, I've got a bunch of letters in my pocket that are dirty and falling apart. They keep me going until new ones come. Being part of frontline troops, we are usually the first to march through the towns, which have cost so much blood and sweat to liberate. But the people are grateful. They know that when we come, the war is over for them. As soon as we enter, we are showered with all they have to spare. What they have to give is simple, but when you're tired and worn out from fighting, you accept their gifts with a lump in your throat. I know now, for certain, what we are fighting for. Our mission is to free all the nations of oppression. Give the children of this and the coming generations a chance to learn the true meaning of freedom. Please give my regards to the Morimotos. Lots of love, Ernest.
This is Second Sergeant Horace Evers writing to his family from Hitler's residence on the 2nd of May of 1945. Dearest Mom and Lou, a year ago today I was sweating out shells on Anzio Beachhead. Today I am sitting in Hitler's luxuriously furnished apartment in Munich, writing a few lines home. What a contrast. A still greater contrast is between the quarters here and the living hell of Dachau concentration only 10 miles from here. I had the misfortune of seeing the camp yesterday, and I still find it hard to believe what my eyes told me. In 2 years of combat, you can imagine, I have seen a lot of death, furious death mostly. Nothing has ever stirred me as much as this. I can't shrug off the feeling of utter hate I now feel for these people. I shot at Germans with the intent to kill before, but only because I had to, or else it was me. Now, I hold no hesitancy whatsoever. How can people do things like that? I never believed they could until now. Miss you all very much, your son, Horace.
This is Sergeant Nathan Hoffman writing to his fiancée, Evelyn. My dearest Evelyn, this should be the letter to end all letters. When you next hear from me, it'll be in person. So long, honey, and pucker up, 'cause here I come. Maybe.
I hope that gave you a little taste of some different soldiers' experiences. I think one of the important things about history is you can't just look at the dates and the facts that are on the walls, but you have to remember that these events happen to real people not much older than these lovely ladies and gentlemen over here. And so I hope that's something you can take away from tonight, is that of all the experiences, the personal stories are the ones that bring it to life the best. And I think we have some more personal stories to share, so I'm going to give the mic back to Mr. Hart.
Hi, we have two very special guest speakers here tonight that share a story that, as some of the letters just portrayed, you don't always get to hear about. I don't know if you guys have a preference for Sherman or Dieter, if you guys, either way you want to go first. Dieter's closer, we'll do that. So this morning, I got an email from one of the other teachers saying that I should make a phone call. And it just said, just call a person, Mr. Renner, just call him. Okay, I'll call him. It's like, I don't know what this is about, so I'll call him. And I called, and his wife answered the phone and told me that Dr. Renner had been 11 and a half years old when Dresden was bombed. He had gone there just recently before as a refugee, and then about a week later, the town was attacked. One of the pieces we're doing tonight is a piece about that attack and that bombing in Dresden in February of 1945. And so Dr. Dieter Renner, Rennie, sorry. I think someone typed in an email wrong. Maybe my fault. He is here to talk to you a little bit about his experience on that side of an attack and that very personal side of it, something we don't get to hear enough about in our regular classroom time. So here is Dr. Rennie.
Thank you, Brad. Well, I was 6 years old when World War II started, and I'm talking about the beginning in Europe. That was in September 1939. I was 11 and a half when I experienced the bombing of the city of Dresden. In between, I lived in different parts of Germany, but throughout most of the war, my family and I lived in the far northeastern part of Germany, in East Prussia, in the city of Königsberg. That's what it was called at that time. Today it has a Russian name, it's called Kaliningrad. We lived there throughout the war, and throughout the war until early 1945. At that time, we began to hear far in the distance, towards the east of us, the Russian artillery as the Red Army was moving closer and closer to Germany proper and closer to our neighborhood. I was an only child, and my mother and I were able to flee from that area by ship across the Baltic Sea. My father had to stay behind. He was a naval architect at the naval shipyard in that city, and got out 2 weeks after my mother and I left. We left and were now refugees, as so many other Germans from that area had become refugees. We had three choices. We could end up in a refugee camp somewhere in the western part of Germany. We didn't like the idea. We could go to the city of Hamburg in northwestern Germany and stay with my grandparents on my father's side. We didn't want to do that either because Hamburg was being bombed all the time. Or we could go stay with my grandmother on my mother's side in the city of Dresden. And Dresden had never really been seriously attacked. Some bombs had been dropped there, but not much had happened throughout the war. So we went to Dresden and went to stay with my grandmother in her 5th floor apartment in an old apartment house in the city. And 8 days after we arrived, the sirens went off. We very quickly made our way down to the air raid shelter, which was the cellar of the building. That was our air raid shelter. There were no elevators in that building, so it was a long way down to the basement. And then we experienced the first real attack on Dresden. It didn't happen in our neighborhood, but it was audible what was happening. This was around 10 o'clock in the evening. Around 11 o'clock in the evening, the all clear sounded and we could go upstairs again, and everything was okay in the apartment. We went to bed, but then around 1 o'clock in the morning, the sirens went off again. We went down to the basement, and this time it really got bad. And there are different ways one can describe what it feels like to be in that kind of a situation. I just want to say this. What we heard first, after we had settled down in the basement, what we heard first was, way up in the distance, the sound of enemy airplanes. In those days, of course, planes didn't have jet engines yet. They had the normal motors, so they were pretty loud. We could hear the engines. Then we could hear a hissing sound, and then we could hear the rumble of exploding bombs. The hissing sound was simply a whole bunch of bombs flying down through the air towards the ground. And then the rolling thunder of bombs exploding. There were a number of bombs that fell in our neighborhood, and when the all clear sounded, we made it very carefully up the stairs again because there was debris all over the place. On every floor we saw apartment doors knocked off their hinges and things like that. We got to our apartment, glass all over the place, the windows were smashed, and a lot of other things that we had to clean up. We did the best we could and then went to bed. And the next morning, my grandmother said to me, "Dieter, why don't you go to the milk store 2 blocks down the street and get us some milk?" And that's what I did. And when I got to the store, I got my milk, and there was a customer coming in, a lady who said, "I heard something on the radio. I think they said there is another group of bomber planes approaching the city. I grabbed my milk and I ran as fast as I could without spilling it back to the apartment, my grandmother's apartment. I told my mother and my grandmother what I had just heard, and we very, very quickly went down to the basement again. What we discovered, of course, was that at that point, the whole alarm system had been knocked out. So there was no sirens, nothing. Nobody knew anything about what was coming. We went downstairs, we knocked on doors on every floor and told people, go down to the basement because there's another attack coming. We went down to the basement, and as soon as that metal door that had been installed for the protection of the people was closed, the first bombs dropped in our neighborhood. We didn't stay there very long because in the middle of that attack, which started around 11 o'clock in the morning, in the middle of that attack, some air raid wardens came into the basement and said, folks, get out, quickly, because that building may collapse on top of you. So we actually got out into the open during the attack and managed to get to one of the suburbs of the city, and there we were safe because nothing had happened in that suburb. The city itself, the city of Dresden, was very, very severely destroyed, and a lot of people lost their lives, but we were lucky. We got out with our skins intact, and were able then to survive the attacks, and were able to get away from the city altogether. My father, in the meantime, had been moved to his former hometown, Hamburg, and so that's where we went, and that's where we experienced the end of the war. Just one quick thing. When you are in a basement like that, when you are in an air raid shelter of that kind, and everything is exploding around you, that's an experience you will never forget. Because that's an experience you probably will never have in any other situation. It's this, the feeling of absolute, total, complete helplessness. You find yourself in your normal life, you find yourself once in a while in a dangerous situation. But you can run away, you can push somebody aside, you can do something about the situation. But when you are in the basement of an apartment building in the middle of an air attack, there's nothing you can do. And you very quickly realize that. Any second now, I may be hit and may die. And I can't run away, I cannot hide anywhere. It's just, you are totally helpless. And this feeling of helplessness, that is something that stays with you for the rest of your life. And I think that's all I want to tell you. When I read Jeff Jardine's comment in the paper yesterday, I saw that tonight we are going to hear a symphony that deals with, that was written in commemoration of the Dresden bombings. I've never heard of it before, and I'm really curious to hear it. But I hope that all of you will enjoy the concert, and that's all I want to say at this point. Thank you very much.
Hey, our other guest speaker is going to be up in a second, but what I want to do first is I want to make sure I take the time now for us to thank my band boosters for preparing this room for the decorations as well as preparing the food. So if we can please give them a round of applause. Now our next speaker has another great story for us to hear and for us to share and talk about. As he is a veteran of the Japanese internment camps here in California, and now I'll introduce to you Mr. Sherman Kishi.
Good evening. I'm Sherman Kishi, and I'm like, the story I'm going to tell you is when I was the same age as some of these kids that are now in high school. I was a junior in high school in Livingston, and let me tell you the story. I was involved very much in the high school athletics, as well as the government of the high school, because I see in the annual that I was the junior class president at Livingston at this time, and I was very much involved in tennis. And so we went out one morning, very early in the morning, to the high school tennis courts in Livingston, and we were playing tennis, and as we were playing tennis, all of a sudden, a car stops by the side of the road, and there were 2 or 3 men in the car, and they started to curse at us. They called us all kinds of names and really gave us a bad time. So we went home quickly, listened to the radio, and that's when we found out that Pearl Harbor had happened. This was December 7th of 1941. I was a 16-year-old junior in high school at this time. That was the beginning of many things that happened to us. You know, the world really changed for the United States when World War II began. That began with the declaration of war against Japan, and very shortly thereafter, they also declared war against all of the 3 nations that were fighting in Europe, against the Germans, the Italians, and also the Japanese. So that was the beginning of very many changes for all of us. One of the things that happened shortly, in 1942, in January 1942, President Roosevelt, who was the president at the time, was sent out an executive order called 9066. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with this, but this order said that all people of Japanese ancestry, not necessarily Japanese ancestry, but what it did was it gave the military commander of the area, the defense commander, who was a General DeWitt, the right to make a determination of whatever he thought was necessary to create the safety of people of the western United States. So the first thing he did shortly thereafter was to declare that an evacuation would happen for all people of Japanese ancestry. And the order that came out when that happened, it said that all people of Japanese ancestry, whether they're aliens or non-aliens, were to report on a certain date to what they called an assembly center. And the assembly center was established at the Merced Fairgrounds. And these assembly centers were established all up and down the West Coast at that time. And all people of Japanese ancestry from Washington, Oregon, and California were put into assembly centers while they established what they call relocation camps throughout all of the rest of the United States. There were camps in Arkansas, Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, Colorado, and Arizona, and California. There were 10 camps established, and they were euphemistically called relocation camps, but they were really concentration camps because every camp had barbed wire around them, and they had guard towers, like in that poster, and the guard towers had soldiers with rifles in them, and the rifles were continually turned in towards the camp, not out to protect any of the people of Japanese ancestry that were put into this. There were 110,000 of us put into these camps within that very short period of time. One of the stories I want to tell you is that at the time, they also established a curfew. And I guess you're familiar with curfews. Well, this curfew was against people of Japanese ancestry. There were posters on the telephone poles and on the fence posts, and the curfew said that we could not go more than 5 miles. You could not be out after dark, and you could not gather in groups. This was a curfew. I was 16 years old, and I had a girlfriend at the time. And I wanted to go visit her, and she was more than 5 miles away. And I wasn't supposed to do that, but I took my dad's pickup and went to visit her. And interestingly, I didn't get caught because there weren't many deputies out and there were no soldiers around. But the reason I'm telling you this basically is the girl that I went to see is sitting right there. This is in 1941. After that, we got married, and we've now been married for 67 years. You know, we tell this story mainly because it happened to us. Those of us who were called non-aliens, we were citizens, we were born here, we grew up here, we went to the schools here. But in spite of that, because of the racial prejudice that went on and the hysteria that happened right after World War II began, that they placed us in these concentration camps. It was bad, but some people, and I was one of them, volunteered out of the camps to go into the military to prove our patriotism to this country. And that's the story of the 442nd Regiment. I went into the military intelligence service to learn the language of Japanese because I didn't know it very well. And I learned the language in 9 months and then was sent eventually both to the Philippines and then into Tokyo right after the war to become a translator and interpreter. So that was my story. The other story I want to tell you a little bit about is the fact that the United States government is the best government in the world. We have a constitution and bylaws that cannot be surpassed anywhere. And one of the things it says in the Constitution is that there is you can seek redress against your government if you feel that the government has done something wrong to you, okay? When we came home from the army or the camps, and people were there for 5 years, was it? 4 years in the camps. But when we came back, those of us who were older, had families, we really never talked to our children about our experiences. But as they grew older, they found out about the experience that we had, and we were very upset and incensed that such a thing happened. And for 10 years, they functioned in the Congress of the United States, had hearings all over, and eventually they started in the 70s, and then eventually in 1988, the Civil Rights Act was passed, which was signed by, who was our president at the time? Reagan. President Reagan signed it, and it gave redress to those people of Japanese ancestry who were placed in the camps. And there were 110,000 of us put in the camps. By that time, there were only 80,000 left that were in the camps. So the government does do this for you. If you are able to do this, then you can get some satisfaction from what was done to you during this period of time. That's a short story I want to tell you.
From the Balico area.
No, I'm from Livingston.
Well, my understanding was that there were many Japanese ancestry around Balico.
Yes, there were.
And so they were interned too, but many of their farms were farmed by local people, and they saved those farms, and when they came back, they gave them back to.
Yes, let me tell you, it's a very short story. Before, I told you about curfew, that we could not go more than 4 or 5 miles, that was a limit. Cortez was about 4 miles from the town of Cressy.
Yes.
And Cressy was about 4 miles from the town of Livingston. Okay, we had cooperatives. The cooperatives, this is agricultural cooperatives. These cooperatives started before 1920. In fact, in Livingston, it started about 1915. So it was quite an old cooperative at this time. The young men that were involved in cooperatives got together. They went the 4 miles that they could go, and they decided to establish a trusteeship. And the trustees were some local people that we trusted very much, and they hired an individual who took charge of all the ranches in Livingston, Balico, Cressy, and Cortez. And those ranches were handled by this person, and all the taxes were paid, and the mortgages were paid, so that when we came back, all the ranches were maintained and were received back by the people that owned them originally. That's the story.
I thought that was